The distress beacon came through at the worst possible time. Roy Camden had exactly 30 credits to his name and a fuel gauge that blinked angry red warnings at him. But the signal promised salvage rights and maybe a decent payout if he could pull off a rescue. He punched coordinates into his battered shuttle and aimed for the mining moon below. Talos 7 looked like someone had taken a hammer to red clay and forgotten to clean up. Canyons split the surface in jagged lines, and dust devils danced across empty plains. Roy brought his shuttle down near the coordinates, landing gear crunching into sand that had probably never felt footsteps before. The wreckage sat wedged between two canyon walls. Roy had seen plenty of crash sites in his 15 years working salvage and rescue, but this ship made him stop and stare. It didn't look built so much as grown, all smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color in the light. Crystalline panels caught the sun and threw rainbow patterns across the rocks. He grabbed his toolkit and started forward. The ship's hull had cracked open like an egg, spilling strange fluids that hissed and bubbled in the sand. Roy picked his way around the debris, already cataloging what might be worth taking if nobody survived. Something moved behind the wreckage. Roy's hand went to the plasma cutter on his belt. Out here, alone, you didn't take chances. He'd heard stories about pirates using fake distress calls to lure in soft-hearted rescuers. The thing that emerged wasn't a pirate. She was huge, easily 4 times his height at the shoulder. Scales covered her body in patterns that reminded Roy of fresh snow, pure white with hints of gold when she moved. Wings folded against her back, tattered and torn at the edges. Her head swung toward him on a long neck, and eyes like molten silver fixed on his face that a dragon. Roy's blood went cold. He'd seen dragons before, but only from a distance. Smart people kept it that way. Dragons were apex hunters, territorial and aggressive. Most stations had signs warning about dragon ships passing through. You stayed out of their way and hoped they didn't notice you. This one noticed him just fine. She moved forward, and Roy realized she wasn't stalking. She was stumbling. One leg dragged, leaving a trail in the sand. Cuts marked her pale scales, and fluid leaked from a wound on her side. Roy raised his hand slowly. Maybe if he backed away carefully, she'd let him leave. The dragon collapsed. She went down like a building falling, sending up clouds of red dust. Her head hit the sand hard enough that Roy felt the impact through his boots. For a second, he thought she died. Then her chest moved, shallow breaths stirring the dust around her nostrils. Roy should have left. Every survival instinct screamed at him to get back in his shuttle and forget he'd ever picked up that distress call. Instead, he found himself walking closer. The dragon's eye opened as he approached. She tried to lift her head and failed. Her mouth moved, and sounds came out that Roy's translator struggled to process. The device on his collar had been cheap even when he'd bought it 5 years ago, and dragon languages apparently pushed it to its limits. "Help!" the translator finally spat out. "Please, inside. Mate, dying." Roy stopped 3 meters away. The dragon watched him, her silver eye tracking his every movement. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe barely into adulthood by dragon standards. Scars marked her scales in patterns that looked deliberate, like someone had carved symbols into her hide. "Your mate is in the ship?" Roy asked. The dragon made a sound that might have been agreement. She lifted one massive foreleg and pointed with a claw toward the broken hull. "Trapped. Cannot reach. Please." The word came out clear that time, like she was learning to use the translator as she spoke. Roy looked from her to the wreckage and back again. His shuttle had maybe enough fuel to get him back to the nearest station if he left now. If he went into that ship and it collapsed, or if this dragon decided humans made decent snacks, nobody would ever find his body out here. The dragon lowered her head until her snout nearly touched the sand between them. The gesture reminded Roy of a dog begging, something so vulnerable it didn't match with the deadly predator in front of him. "Please," she said again. "Will not hurt. Promise. Please save mate." Roy had lost people before. He knew what that kind of desperation looked like. It transcended species, apparently. "I'll look," he said, "but if your mate tries to eat me, I'm leaving." "Understood." The dragon's eye closed for a moment, something that might have been relief passing across her face. "Understood. Thank you." Thank you. Roy adjusted his toolkit and started toward the broken ship. Behind him, the albino dragon dragged herself a few meters closer, close enough to watch but too injured to follow him inside. As he reached the hull breach, Roy wondered what kind of idiot risked his neck for creatures that could bite him in half. The same kind of idiot who couldn't walk away from someone begging for help. Apparently, he climbed through the breach and into darkness. Roy's headlamp cut through the darkness inside the ship. The beam revealed walls that pulsed with dying light, bioluminescent panels fading like dying fireflies. Everything curved in ways that made his eyes hurt, organic architecture that clearly hadn't been designed with human guests in mind. The corridor twisted deeper into the ship. Roy had to crawl in places where the ceiling had collapsed, dragging his toolkit behind him. Strange fluids dripped from overhead, hissing where they hit his jacket sleeve. He wiped the substance away quickly and kept moving. Sound echoed from somewhere ahead. Breathing, rough and labored. Roy followed it through a doorway that had been torn half off its mountings. The chamber beyond must have been beautiful once. Now it looked like a bomb had gone off inside. Equipment Roy couldn't identify lay scattered across the floor, sparking and smoking. Support beams had fallen in an X pattern across the center of the room, and beneath them lay the largest dragon Roy had ever seen. Dark scales covered the trapped dragon's body, black with hints of deep blue when Roy's light hit them at certain angles. One wing stretched out at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The dragon's eyes opened as Roy entered, pupils narrowing to slits in the sudden light. "Stay back," the dragon rumbled. His voice came out deeper than the female's, resonating in Roy's chest like thunder. "Do not come closer, human." Roy stopped at the edge of the debris field. "Your mate sent me. She's outside, hurt bad. Said you're trapped." The dark dragon tried to move and failed. A sound somewhere between a growl and a whimper escaped his throat. "Silvara should not have brought you. Humans cannot be trusted. Leave us." "Yeah, well, she didn't give me much choice." Roy set down his toolkit and started examining the fallen beams. They'd come from a ceiling supports, heavy crystalline structures that looked like they weighed several tons each. "How long have you been stuck here?" "Since the crash." "For hours, maybe 5. The dragon's breathing hitched. "The ship's core is damaged." "Can you not hear it?" Roy listened. Beneath the creaking of stressed metal and the spark of dying electronics, he caught a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. He'd heard that sound before on ships with unstable power cores. "How long until it blows?" he asked. "Unknown. An hour. Perhaps less." Roy pulled out his scanner and swept it over the beams. The readings made him swear under his breath. The structures were denser than steel and fused partially into the floor where they'd fallen. His cutting torch might get through them given enough time, but time was exactly what they didn't have. "What's your name?" Roy asked, already pulling cable from his kit. The dragon watched him with suspicious eyes. "Why does it matter?" "Because if I'm going to die trying to get you out of here, I'd like to know who I'm dying for." "Name's Roy Camden." A long pause. "Asheron. My name is Asheron." Roy nodded and started rigging a pulley system using intact support beams as anchor points. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from dozens of rescue operations. Most of those had been pulling miners from collapsed tunnels, not dragons from alien ships, but the principle stayed the same. "Silvara said you were fleeing something," Roy said as he worked. "What kind of trouble are you two in?" Asheron's eyes tracked Roy's movements. "We refused a bonding contract. My clan wanted Silvara to mate with a war leader's son. She's albino, you see, rare coloring. They thought it would strengthen their bloodline." Roy attached a hydraulic jack to his pulley system. "But you two wanted each other instead. We chose each other." The way Asheron said it made it sound like the most important thing in the universe. In Dragon Society, such choices are not permitted. We are tools for our clans, nothing more. Sounds like a terrible way to live. Roy tested his rig, then started pumping the jack. The beam shifted half an inch. "Is the only way we have known." Asheron watched the beam rise with something like hope in his eyes. "Until Silvara suggested we run. I thought she was mad. Where we go? How will we survive?" The beam rose another inch. Roy's arms burned from working the jack, but he kept pumping. She seems pretty determined. Must love you a lot to risk all that. I did not understand this word. Love. The translator renders it, but the meaning escapes me. Roy paused and looked at the dragon. You flew across space, left your entire world behind, and you don't know what love means. We feel connection, bond. She is part of me, and I am part of her. When she hurts, I hurt. When she feels joy, I feel it also. Ashren's voice dropped. Is that what humans call love? Yeah, Roy said quietly. That's exactly what it is. The beam rose high enough for Ashren to try pulling himself free. He strained against the weight, still pinning his wing, claws scraping deep gouges in the floor. Roy grabbed his other side and pulled, adding his weight to the effort. Ashren came free with a tearing sound. His wing dragged behind him, clearly broken in several places. The dragon collapsed, gasping. Can you move? Roy asked. I must. Ashren struggled to his feet, favoring 3 legs and keeping the broken wing tucked close. The core grows louder. Roy heard it too. The whine had risen to a shriek. We need to go now. They made it 3 steps before alarms started blaring throughout the ship. Red light flooded the corridors, and the walls began shaking. Faster, Roy shouted, though he knew Ashren was already moving as fast as his injuries allowed. They stumbled toward the exit together, human and dragon racing against time. Behind them, the ship screamed its dying song. They burst through the hull breach into blinding sunlight. Silvara lifted her head from the sand, eyes widening when she saw Ashren limping beside Roy. She tried to stand and managed to get her front legs under her before collapsing again. Leave me, she said. Take Ashren. Get him away from here. Roy ignored her and ran for his shuttle. The ship groaned behind him, metal screaming as internal supports gave way. He'd give them 5 minutes, maybe 10 if they were lucky. His shuttle looked impossibly small next to the 2 dragons. Roy did quick math in his head and didn't like the answer. The shuttle could carry maybe 1,500 kilos of cargo, 2,000 if he pushed it. Each dragon probably weighed twice that. Both of you, over here now. Roy yanked open the cargo bay door and started throwing out everything non-essential. Spare parts, his personal belongings, tools he'd owned for years, all of it hit the sand in a growing pile. Ashren reached the shuttle first, moving in an awkward 3-legged hobble. Silvara dragged herself after him, leaving a trail of blood in the red sand. You cannot carry us both, Ashren said. We are too heavy. The mathematics are simple. I'm not doing math right now. I'm doing engineering. Roy pulled out every meter of cable he owned and started lashing it together. Silvara, can you breathe fire? The albino dragon blinked. Of course. All dragons can. Good. I need you to heat this rock. Roy kicked a boulder the size of his head. Get glowing hot. Hot as you can make it. Silvara didn't question. She opened her mouth and flame poured out, white hot and focused. The rock began to glow red, then orange, then bright yellow. When Roy judged it hot enough, he used a metal bar to roll it onto a sheet of hull plating he'd torn from the crashed ship. What are you doing? Ashren asked. Making a sled. Roy bent the edges of the hull, plating upward, using the heat from the rock to make the metal pliable. Both of you get on. Stay as close together as possible. The dragons exchanged looks, but climbed onto the makeshift sled. Roy lashed the cable around them both, then attached the other end to his shuttle's towing hook. This will never work, Ashren said. Probably not. Roy climbed into the pilot's seat and fired up the engines. But it's better than definitely dying here. The crashed ship's alarms reached a fever pitch. Through his windscreen, Roy saw the hull beginning to buckle inward. Whatever was happening to the core, it was happening fast. He engaged the engines. The shuttle lurched forward, cable going taut with a metallic groan. For a second, nothing happened. The dragons were too heavy, the sled digging into sand. Roy pushed the throttle forward. The engines screamed in protest. Every warning light on his console turned red. The shuttle strained, shaking hard enough to rattle his teeth. The sled moved, inch by inch at first, then faster as momentum built. Roy aimed for open ground away from the canyon walls. The shuttle barely cleared the rocks, towing cables scraping against stone with showers of sparks. "Higher!" Silvara shouted. The ship. Roy looked back and saw the crashed vessel starting to collapse in on itself. Light bled from every crack in the hull, bright enough to hurt his eyes. He pulled back on the controls. The shuttle climbed, engines howling. The sled swung wildly below them, dragons clinging to the metal plate. Altimeter reading climbed past 100 meters, 200, 300. The ship exploded. The shockwave hit like a physical blow. Roy's shuttle spun, alarms shrieking as the blast threw them sideways. He fought the controls, trying to compensate, but the sled's weight worked against him. They tumbled through the air, engines cutting in and out. Below, a fireball rose into the sky. The canyon walls funneled the explosion upward in a column of flame and debris. Pieces of crystalline hull shot past them like missiles. Roy leveled out at 500 meters, hands shaking on the controls. The engines sounded like they were about to tear themselves apart, but they held. The sled steadied below them, dragons still lashed to its surface. "Everyone alive down there?" Roy called over the comm. "Alive," Silvara answered. Her voice sounded thin. "Barely." Roy checked his fuel gauge and felt his stomach drop. The gauge read nearly empty. He'd burned through his reserves, pulling the dragons to safety. They had enough juice to make orbit, but landing anywhere was going to be interesting. "Hold on," he said. "This ride's not over yet." He aimed for space and prayed his shuttle held together long enough to get them there. Behind them, the explosion's mushroom cloud rose toward the sky, marking the grave of the ship that had brought 2 dragons across the stars. Roy had pulled off some crazy rescues in his time, but this one took the prize. He'd saved 2 dragons who by all rights should have eaten him. He destroyed his own cargo to make room for them. He'd burned his fuel reserve and probably broken half the systems in his shuttle. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they were still alive. The dragons rode their makeshift sled in silence as the shuttle climbed. Talos, 7 fell away below them, red sands giving way to the black of space. Roy allowed himself one shaky breath before focusing on the next problem. Where exactly could he take 2 fugitive dragons who just lost everything they owned? The answer came to him after a moment. Station Ceres. 9 set out past the asteroid belt, far enough from civilized space that people didn't ask too many questions. Roy had maintained a workshop there for 3 years, never quite calling it home, but using it more than any other port. If they could make it that far on fumes and hope, maybe they'd all survive this after all. His hand still shook on the controls, but Roy smiled despite himself. Sometimes the universe gave you impossible problems just to see what you do with them. That he set course for Ceres 9 and hoped his fuel lasted. They limped in a Ceres 9 on fumes and prayer. Roy's shuttle made sounds no ship should make, and station traffic control seemed too surprised by the 2 dragons riding a sled behind him to ask proper questions. He guided them to his workshop at the station's far end, away from prying eyes. The workshop took up half a warehouse unit. Roy had collected equipment over years of salvage work. Welders, diagnostic stations, storage crates full of parts. He cleared the main floor and brought the dragons inside before anyone could get too curious. Silvara collapsed immediately. Ashrin managed to stay upright long enough to check on her before his legs gave out. They lay together in the middle of the workshop, taking up most of the available space. Roy grabbed his medical kit. The supplies inside were meant for humans, but injuries were injuries. He started with Silvara, cleaning the wound on her side and sealing it with industrial bonding agent. She hissed in pain, but stayed still. "This is going to leave a scar," Roy said. "I have many scars already." Silvara's voice came out tired. "What is one more?" Roy moved to Ashren's broken wing. The damage looked bad, bones clearly fractured in multiple places. He had no idea how dragon wings were supposed to work, let alone how to fix one. "I cannot set this myself," Roy admitted. "I don't know enough about your anatomy." "Show me what to do," Ashrin said. "I will guide you." For the next 3 hours, Roy followed Ashren's instructions. They straightened bones, wrapped the wing in splints made from scrap metal, and secured everything with medical tape. The work was delicate and painful. Ashrin never complained, but his claws carved deep furrows in the workshop floor. When Roy finally finished, both dragons fell into exhausted sleep. He sat on a workbench and watched them breathe. Silvara had curled around Asherin, her white scales contrasting against his dark ones. Their tails intertwined, and even unconscious they stayed pressed close together. Roy had lost people who meant that much to him once. Wife and daughter, gone in an evacuation that went wrong. He'd been the pilot, responsible for getting civilians off a dying colony. The ship had taken damage on liftoff. He'd made it to space with half his passengers still aboard, the other half left behind when the colony's atmosphere had ignited. He hadn't flown rescue missions since. Couldn't bear the weight of deciding who lived and who died. Instead, he'd worked salvage, dealing with machines and wreckage where failure only meant lost profit. Watching the two dragons sleep, Roy wondered if he'd been running from the wrong thing all along. Days passed. Asherin healed faster than Roy expected, his wing knitting back together with a speed that seemed impossible. Silvara's wound closed cleanly, though she moved carefully for the first week. They talked while they recovered. Roy learned about dragon clans, ancient hierarchies where bloodlines mattered more than individuals. Silvara explained how her coloring marked her as defective in her clan's eyes, valuable only for breeding but never respected. "They wanted my eggs," she said one evening. "Not me, just what I could produce for them." Asherin had refused the match arranged for him and declared his choice to bond with Silvara instead. That decision had made them both outcasts. "Where were you headed?" Roy asked. "Before the crash?" "The neutral territories," Asherin said. "Beyond the Veil Nebula. We heard there were colonies there that accepted refugees." Roy knew the area. Lawless space where the major powers didn't reach. Dangerous for anyone traveling alone, but possibly safe for those with nowhere else to go. "You'll need a ship," he said. "Yours is scattered across half of Talos 7. "We have no currency," Silvara said quietly. "Nothing to trade. We lost everything in the crash." Roy looked around his workshop. He owned the shuttle, his tools, and not much else. Most of his credits went to station fees and fuel. He wasn't rich by any measure, but he also wasn't using his workspace to its full potential. "I might have an idea," he said. "Give me a few days to work on it." The idea grew as Ashren's wing healed. Roy had salvage rights to dozens of wrecks in the local asteroid field. Most weren't worth recovering, but they had parts he could use. He spent 3 days in his shuttle pulling components from dead ships, building up a stockpile in the workshop. Silvara watched him work with curious eyes. "What are you making?" "Insurance," Roy said. Not elaborating. On the 4th day, station security came knocking. A human officer Roy vaguely recognized stood at the workshop entrance, looking uncomfortable. "Got to report you're harboring illegal aliens," the officer said. "2 dragons." "That true?" Roy stepped outside and sealed the workshop door behind him. "I've got salvage I pulled from crash site. Legal salvage rights, filed and registered. Salvage doesn't usually breathe." The officer tried to look past Roy into the workshop. "Mind if I check? You got a warrant?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Look, Roy, I don't want trouble, but dragons are dangerous. People are nervous having them here. They're injured and recovering. They're not dangerous to anyone." Roy crossed his arms. "And unless you've got legal cause to enter my property, you could be nervous somewhere else." The standoff lasted a minute before the officer backed down. "This isn't over. People are asking questions. Let them ask." Roy watched the officer leave before going back inside. Silvara and Asherin had heard everything. They looked at Roy with expressions he couldn't quite read. "You risk much for us," Asherin said. "Why?" Roy grabbed a wrench and went back to his work. "Because you deserve better than dying alone on some moon. And because..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Because I've spent too long running from things. Maybe it's time I stood still for once." Silvara made a sound low in her throat, something between a purr and a rumble. "You are strange, Roy Camden. Humans are said to be weak and fearful. You are neither." "I'm plenty scared," Roy said. "Just tired of letting fear make all my decisions." He didn't tell them about his wife and daughter. Didn't explain how helping them had cracked open something in his chest he'd thought permanently sealed. Some things were too personal to share, even with people who'd become something like friends. The workshop fell quiet except for the sound of tools on metal and the soft breathing of dragons. Outside, Roy knew trouble was brewing. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. That had to be enough. The bounty hunter arrived on day 12. Roy heard about him before seeing him, word spreading through the station that someone was asking questions about dragons. Asking with credits backing up the questions, which meant people talked. Roy found him at the Central Market, a Volner mercenary with scales that shimmered green gold under the lights. The Volner were reptilian like dragons, but smaller, more humanoid in build. This one carried weapons openly, which was technically illegal, but nobody seemed eager to confront him about it. "You're Roy Camden," the bounty hunter said when Roy approached. "Not a question. Depends who's asking. Someone willing to pay for information." The Volner pulled out a datapad showing images of Silvara and Asherin, two fugitive dragons, worth 50,000 credits alive, 20,000 each if delivered dead. Roy kept his face neutral. 50,000 was more money than he'd see in 5 years of salvage work. "Haven't seen them," he said. The bounty hunter smiled, showing too many teeth. "Station records show you filed salvage rights on Talos 7-9 days ago. Same day, these two crashed there. Strange coincidence. Lots of strange coincidences in space." Indeed, the bounty hunter tilted his head. "You know what I think, Camden? I think you're a soft-hearted fool who picked up passengers he can't afford to keep. I think you're running out of credits and options. 50,000 could solve a lot of problems." Roy wanted to punch the smile off the mercenary's face. Instead, he shrugged. "Think what you want. I don't have your dragons." He walked away before the bounty hunter could respond. His hands shook, adrenaline making his heart race. The Volner wouldn't stop looking. Someone would talk eventually. Roy needed to move the dragons off station, but Asherin still couldn't fly properly, and they had no ship. Back at the workshop, Roy found Silvara and Asherin waiting. "We heard," Silvara said. "The bounty hunter. He seeks us." "Yeah." Roy started checking his supplies, mentally calculating what they'd need for a run to the neutral territories. "We need to leave. Tonight, if possible." "No." Asherin stood, his healing wing partially extended. "We will not let you sacrifice more for us. You have already given too much." "I'm not asking your permission," Roy snapped. "That bounty hunter finds you here, you're dead or captured. Neither option works for me." "Why not?" Silvara moved closer, her silver eyes intense. "We are nothing to you. Strangers you pulled from a crash. Yet you risk everything. Your home, your safety, your livelihood. For what?" Roy set down the supplies he'd been gathering. The question hung in the air between them, demanding an honest answer. "I lost people once," he said finally. "People I was supposed to save. I was flying evacuation runs from a dying colony. Got half my passengers out before the whole thing went up. Spent the last 3 years telling myself I did my best, that I couldn't have saved them all." He looked at the two dragons. "But I stopped trying after that. Stopped taking rescue jobs. Stopped putting myself in positions where I might fail again. And you know what? It didn't make the guilt go away. It just made me smaller." Silvara stepped forward until she stood directly in front of him. "You think saving us will redeem you?" "No, I know nothing redeems that." Roy met her eyes. "But maybe helping you means I stop running from who I used to be. Maybe that's enough." Asherin moved to join them, creating a small circle in the middle of the workshop. "In dragon culture," he said slowly, "there's a thing called soul bonding. It marks two beings as family, deeper than blood. It is sacred, almost never shared with other species." Silvara touched her snout gently to Roy's shoulder. "Would you accept such a bond? It would mark you as under our protection. No dragon could harm you without declaring war on both our bloodlines." Roy understood what they were offering. Protection, but also obligation. Bonds went both ways. "Won't that make you targets too?" he asked. "We are already targets," Asherin said. "This would give meaning to our flight. Purpose beyond simple survival." Before Roy could respond, alarms blared through the station. Emergency lights bathed the workshop in red. Through the entrance, Roy saw security officers running past, weapons drawn. The bounty hunter had made his move. No time, Roy said. Whatever you're offering, do it now or we need to run. Silvara and Asherin exchanged a look. Some wordless communication passed between them. Silvara stepped closer and pressed her forehead against Roy's chest. Heat radiated from her scales, growing warmer until Roy felt like he was standing too close to a fire. Words poured from her mouth in a language Roy's translator couldn't handle. Ancient sounds, rhythmic and powerful. Asherin joined in, his deeper voice harmonizing with hers. The heat concentrated on Roy's left arm. He watched as patterns appeared on his skin, glowing white gold like Silvara's scales. The marks twisted into shapes that might have been writing, burning themselves into his flesh. Pain came sharp and sudden, then faded to warmth. When Silvara pulled back, Roy's arm bore a permanent mark from wrist to elbow. It looked like fire frozen in skin, beautiful and alien. "It is done," Silvara said. "You are soul-bonded. Family." The workshop door exploded inward. The bounty hunter stood in the entrance, flanked by security officers who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Found them," the Volner said. "And look, the helpful human who said he hadn't seen them." Roy stepped between the bounty hunter and the dragons. He raised his left arm, showing the glowing marks. "These dragons are under my protection," he said clearly. "Soul-bonded by dragon law. You touch them, you're declaring war on their bloodlines." The bounty hunter's eyes widened. Behind him, the security officers stepped back. Everyone knew what dragon soul bonds meant. They were sacred, recognized across galactic law. Breaking one meant retribution from entire dragon clans. "You're lying," the bounty hunter said, but his voice held uncertainty. Asherin moved forward, extending his own foreleg. He pressed it against Roy's right arm. More heat, more ancient words, another mark burning into skin. "Two bonds," Asherin said. "Roy Camden is twice marked. Our brother in all ways that matter." The bounty hunter stared at the marks on Roy's arms. Slowly, his hand moved away from his weapon. "This isn't over," he said. "Someone will pay for this." But he was already backing away, and the security officers had already lowered their weapons. Nobody wanted trouble with soul-bonded dragons. The workshop fell silent after they left. Roy looked at his arms, at the permanent marks now part of his skin. "Well," he said, "guess I'm family now." Silvara and Asherin pressed close on either side of him, their warmth surrounding him. "Family," Silvara agreed softly. "Always." 3 months later, Roy stood on the observation deck of a transport hub in neutral space. Ships came and went through the massive station, carrying cargo and passengers to places the major governments didn't reach. Behind him, Silvara and Asherin discussed supply routes with a Telka merchant who didn't seem bothered by their presence. A lot had changed since Series 9. The soul bonds had bought them time, but staying on the station had been impossible. Too many questions, too much attention. Roy had sold his workshop for enough credits to buy passage out, and they'd headed for the territories beyond the Veil Nebula. What they'd found there surprised everyone. The neutral territories weren't lawless chaos like Roy had expected. Instead, he'd discovered communities of refugees from a dozen species, all trying to build something away from their homeworlds. Beings who didn't fit, who'd been cast out or had chosen to leave. They'd created their own society based on different rules. Rules that didn't care about bloodlines or proper behavior. Rules that said you were judged by your actions, not your birth. Roy found a place there almost immediately. Mechanics were always needed, and his skills with both human and alien technology made him valuable. Within a week, he'd set up a new workshop. Within a month, people were bringing him problems that went beyond simple repairs. "This refugee says her clan won't let her bond with who she wants," they'd say. Or, "These two need somewhere safe to stay." Or, "Can you help us figure out how to make this ship run on different fuel?" Roy solved problems. That's what he did. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped running from his past and started building a future. A young Kellen approached him on the observation deck. The amphibious alien looked nervous, holding a datapad like a shield. "Master Roy," the Kellen asked, "I have questions about the engine designs you showed me." Roy smiled. He'd started teaching mechanics to anyone who wanted to learn. Turned out lots of refugees needed skills to survive out here. Show me what's confusing you, he said. They spent 20 minutes going over thruster configurations before Silvara joined them. The Kellen didn't flinch at her presence anymore. Most of the younger refugees had grown up around the dragons and saw them as protectors rather than threats. We have another arrival, Silvara said after the Kellen left. A family from the outer rings. They need shelter. Put them in Bay 12, Roy said. I'll check their ship tomorrow. Make sure it's safe for the next leg of their journey. Silvara's tail swished in what Roy had learned was amusement. You have become a caretaker, Roy Camden. Strange fate for a man who claimed to work only with machines. Yeah, well, machines are easier. But Roy was smiling as he said it. They walked back through the station together. Roy's workshop took up an entire section now, expanded with help from Ashren's metalworking skills. The Dark Dragon had discovered a talent for shaping alloys, creating sculptures that doubled as structural supports. His art decorated half the station, beautiful and functional. Inside the workshop, a dozen projects waited. Ships needing repair, equipment that needed adaptation for species with different physical requirements, experimental designs for systems that might work better in neutral space. Roy had 3 apprentices now, young beings from different worlds learning the trade. They looked up when he entered, eager for guidance. The jump drive on the transport in Base 6 is acting strange, one apprentice said. The harmonics are off. Did you check the resonance chambers? Roy asked. Yes, but I don't understand what I'm seeing. Roy grabbed his tools. Come on, I'll show you. The work filled his days now. Not the lonely salvage runs of before, but collaborative problem solving with people who depended on him. It should have been more pressure, more weight. Instead, Roy felt lighter than he had in years. That evening, he sat with Silvara and Ashren in their shared quarters. The space was large enough for 2 dragons and 1 human, decorated with items they collected during their months in neutral territory. I have been thinking, Ashren said, about what comes next. Next, Roy looked up from the design schematic he'd been studying. We cannot stay on this station forever. Others arrive, daily seeking what we found. Shelter, purpose, community. Ashren's tail wrapped around Silvara's. Perhaps we should build something more permanent. Silvara nodded. A settlement. Somewhere refugees can go to start again. Roy considered the idea. They had resources now, connections with merchants and transporters. The neutral territories had plenty of unclaimed moons and asteroids suitable for habitation. We need help, he said. Construction crews, supply lines, agreements with the local powers. We would have help, Silvara said. Look at what has grown here in 3 months. Imagine what could grow in 3 years. Roy looked at the soul bond marks on his arms. They'd faded from glowing white gold to subtle patterns in his skin, but they were still there, still visible, still marking him as family to 2 dragons who'd changed everything that he thought about the young Kellen learning engineering, about the families arriving weekly, desperate for safe harbor, about his own journey from broken salvage operator to something like a community leader. All right, he said, let's build something. Ashren's rumbling laugh filled the quarters. You decide quickly, Roy Camden. Learn that from you too. Sometimes you have to jump before you're ready. They planned late into the night, sketching ideas and discussing possibilities. By morning, they had the skeleton of a plan. By the end of the week, they'd recruited help from a dozen species. By month's end, they'd selected a moon in a stable orbit around a gas giant and begun the first construction. Roy named it Haven. Simple, direct, honest, the settlement grew slowly but steadily. More refugees arrived, bringing skills and knowledge. They built living quarters, workshops, greenhouses for food production. Dragon and human and alien working side by side, creating something new. Sometimes Roy stood on Haven's surface and looked up at the stars. He thought about the canyon on Talos, 7, about the moment when an albino dragon had fallen before him begging for help. That moment had changed everything. He'd walked into that canyon carrying the weight of old failures, convinced he was broken beyond repair. He'd walked out carrying 2 injured dragons and something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. The soul bonds pulsed warmly on his arms, connecting him to Silvara and Ashren wherever they were. He felt their contentment, their hope for what they were building together. Roy had spent years believing that his greatest moment had been his worst failure. Turns out he'd just been waiting for the right moment to try again. Not to redeem the past, but to create something worth building toward the future. That he smiled and headed back to work. Haven wouldn't build itself, and people were counting on him. Some rescues saved everyone involved. This one had saved him most of all,